Morning and good evening to everyone. So my name is Mika and I am joined by my fellow interns from the Philippines, RJ and M, for today's exceptional guest. We have the honor to interview Karen Mulhauser, an important figure who has forwarded the CEDAW initiative in one of the world's most prominent cities to date. She is the founder and president of Mulhauser and Associates, an inclusive management and public affairs consulting firm that aids organizations in designing and implementing programs fit for their needs. Karen is also the founder and coordinator of Consulting Women LLC for 32 years, offering women consultants networking and professional support in the Washington metropolitan area, which has now represented more than 1,000 self-employed women in DC. Also the founder and coordinator of Trusted Sources, she partners with various nonpartisan organizations in encouraging their members to register and vote during state and federal elections. She has been a member of the DC Human Rights Commission since 2015 and is an advisor to the Coalition for Women's Appointment since 2020. RJ?
Her past affiliations include being the executive director of the National Abortion Rights Action League from 1975 to 1981. She also became the former chair of the United Nations Association of Women. Aside from that, she served as the senior advisor of women for Obama from January 2001 to 2004, where she was tasked to recruit and mobilize women to be more involved with Obama for America in Washington, D.C.
Ms. Mulhauser was born in Burlington, Vermont, and she graduated from Antioch College in Ohio with a bachelor's degree in biology in 1965. She spent a year at Tufts University School of Medicine studying physiology before opting out with the intent to work with people instead. She then taught high school chemistry and physics at the Cambridge School of Weston for 2 years. During this time, students would approach her to talk about sensitive topics such as sexuality or abortion. In an interview with the Veteran Feminists of America, she said that these conversations served as her introduction to the women's movement. She then began to initiate sex education programs and created a course on the social responsibility of scientists for students committed to careers in the sciences. She became a full-time volunteer at a pregnancy counseling service in Boston, and in 1970 to 1973, she trained family planning professionals in federally funded programs in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. So everyone, please give our warm guest a very warm welcome. We're glad to have you here, Ms. Mulhauser.
Well, I'm very glad to be with you, and you give me hope for the future. It's wonderful to talk with the next generation of leaders, and so thank you very much for spending this time with me today. I'm going to learn from you as you learn from me, so thank you. And if you live as long as this, then you do have a long resume. So your resumes will be full of activities like that as well, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for the advice. So now we'll get on with the interview. So first, we'd like to ask, how did you first learn about Cities for CEDAW, and why did you decide to devote yourself to the movement?
I'm going to be happy to answer all of your questions, but first, I'm believing, Sarah, that you and I have communicated by emails. Okay, I just wanted to double check that. Either that or there's another Sarah Ernst out there in the universe, so it's you, okay. Well, I first got involved and knew about CEDAW. Since the year 2000, I have been involved with the United Nations Association, and I was involved with first the National Capital Area Chapter, which is Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia, so a kind of a large geographic area. So I started in 2000, and I learned about CEDAW a couple of years later, and wanted to do something in my own community. And as you probably know, in the United States, CEDAW was introduced in 1979, and in the United States in 1980, our President Carter signed it. But we are one of the 6 countries in the world that has not ratified it. So, I mean, you all are experts on CEDAW, so you knew all of that. But it's a pretty serious embarrassment for some of us that our country has not yet gone on record supporting gender equity. So with organizations around the country, a lot of them involving United Nations Association chapters, there's been a massive effort to bring the issue to local communities and then eventually bring it to the national level for ratification. But even in the Philippines, you're probably reading about our current government in the United States. And it's going to be a while. We would have to do some major election and overturning a number of current politicians in order to get CEDAW ratified. So that's one of the things I'm working on now. But I got started in the early 2000s thinking about CEDAW. It was a long answer to a pretty short question, but
That's all right. So, apart from that, what was your involvement with Cities for CEDAW? Like, how often did you meet? Did you hold any public meetings? Contact with any other cities that passed a CEDAW legislature? All that jazz.
All that jazz, yes. Well, we actually in Washington, D.C. Didn't have legislation introduced until 2015. And the chapter that I was the president of at that time, the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, had a meeting in January of 2015. And as part of my remarks as the leader of the chapter, I talked about how it would be nice for us to work on CEDAW and have it passed in Washington, D.C. And there were 3 city council members. We don't have a governor in Washington, D.C. We don't have a state legislature because we're not a state, but we have a D.C. council, and 3 council members were with us at that time. And one of them said, well, I'll introduce some legislation. And so I worked with his office and with him for a while, and he did introduce it in March of 2015. And as you know, March is International Women's Month. And so that was a totally appropriate time for him to introduce it, and had co-sponsorship from a number of other council members, almost all of the council. I think all but 3 members of the DC Council had sponsored it. So perhaps we were just overconfident and not realizing that we needed to do a whole lot more advocacy and lobbying for it to actually have a hearing and then have a vote. And in Washington, D.C., the D.C. Council, when legislation is introduced, there's first a hearing. There has to be a hearing. And then after the hearing, there has to be 2 votes by the D.C. Council. And none of that happened in 2015. So it died when the council session ended. So I can go on with what we did next. We wrote again repeatedly to DC council members to have it reintroduced. And as you all know, because you're experts on CEDAW, one of the first things that we need to do in order to have a CEDAW truly implemented is to have an audit of the gender issues throughout the community. And so in 2017, a different council member wrote a letter to a DC agency called the city administrator. And there are about 85 different DC agencies. And one of the things that the city administrator's office does is to ask each agency every year to submit a performance report. And part of that performance report is to answer a series of questions like, how many staff do you have? What are the salaries? And so forth. And one of our volunteers had done some research and found, searched each of these 85 agencies, searching for words like woman, female, gender, and could hardly find any references at all. And so with that kind of data, we were asking the city administrator to add gender to the performance reports, and that never happened. So we still don't have, but that is, as you know, the first step for CEDAW. We're not sure how to improve gender equity until we know what the status of gender equity is. So shall I go on with the history of what happened in DC, or do you have a different question, Mika?
Oh, actually, that was actually our next question. If you could go on with the movement history in DC.
Okay. Well, I only got us through 2017, so there's more. And for a while, there was not much activity at all, except I and we had a wonderful relationship, and you'll appreciate this, Jessica, with the University of District of Columbia Law School. They had a law clinic where the lawyers, the law students had a chance to practice law with clients, and UNA National Capital Area was a client of UDC Law School. And so they did a lot of work for us. They helped draft the letter to the city administrator asking for a gender audit to be done, and worked in many other ways, preparing materials that we could use with the mayor's office. And the mayor has an office of women policy and initiatives, and so we forged a good relationship with them as well. So we kept working more behind the scenes. We were disappointed that there was not a gender audit, but it was not until more recently that a legislation was introduced just this year to again have what is the title of it is Elimination of Discrimination Against Women is the name of the legislation that was introduced. And again, it had most of these DC council members signed on as sponsors. And another thing that UNA-NCA did back in 2015 and 16, as well as again this year, is to reach out to DC community organizations to identify collaborating partners, other organizations that would work with us. I should have said back in 2015, part of our advocacy effort was to convene public forums where UNA-NCA would invite its member, but the partner organizations would invite all of their members to come to public education forums. And at these forums, we'd have experts speaking about different aspects of gender inequity and what needs to be done to get gender equity in areas of health, including reproductive health and equal pay and so forth. And sort of making the case that this is why we need to have CEDAW implemented in DC. And we would hand out a factual document. And in that document, we had a sample letter that they could use to send to their DC council member. And we had offered their email addresses and Twitter handles. And so we tried to make it as easy as possible for them to communicate with their DC council members. And we know a lot of that did happen, but nonetheless, in 2015, it did not have a hearing or a vote. So we're doing similar things this year, again, working with the Mayor's Office on Women in Policy Initiatives. One difference between the two pieces of legislation is that the initial legislation in 2015 was going to be implemented by the DC Office of Human Rights in case any of the gender equity studies identified DC agencies that were not adding up to having gender equity. Their women were not getting paid as much, they were not getting promoted as much, and so forth. And so the reason it was placed in the Office of Human Rights is that that office could then provide the training to help them become gender equal. And I am on the DC Human Rights Commission. It's a position appointed by the mayor. And so I would raise it at every meeting. And my commission colleagues, I think, while they respected that, there was not much that we could do as commissioners. In any case, I'm still on the DC Human Rights Commission, and it has not come up in our meetings this year, but there is a deep commitment in the Office of Human Rights and other offices for gender equity. So we are more hopeful this year. And this year that the bill was introduced, there was a hearing. I testified and the Office of Human Rights testified. And I should say that this year the implementation of CEDAW is going to be in the Mayor's Office of Women in Policy Initiatives. And so we are working with that office, and they would be eager to take this on as part of their work. Plus, I think that there are ways that we can create public-private partnerships, that there are ways that some of the DC community organizations would be eager to work with the DC government to implement the policy. So that's something that may happen after we need to have the 2 votes. That hasn't happened yet, and our DC council is in recess. So there has to, as soon as they get back, there have to be the 2 votes, and then it needs to be signed by the mayor, and then it needs to be sent to the Congress. And as I said earlier, the Congress has 30 days, 30 business days. So it doesn't count days if they're on holiday, it doesn't count weekends or when they are in recess, but 30 business days to indicate that they don't want us to have this legislation. Washington, DC, the nation's capital, the center of democracy, allegedly, in many ways, does not have voting representation in Congress. Every other state, I mean, you probably all know this, but every other state has 2 senators and representatives in the House of Representatives. We do have a delegate to the US House of Representatives, but she doesn't have a vote. So she would be eager to help us with this legislation, but there's not much that we can do until those 30 days pass. And the Congress, there are people in Congress that if they knew that this was happening, they would say, no, don't let DC have CEDAW. So we don't want to be too noisy about this at the national level until those 30 days have passed. And usually Congress does not go on record saying, yes, you can have that law. They only go on record when they want to say, no, you can't have that law. So we're going to wait for those 30 days. But then once the 30 days have passed, if they have not said no, then we want to make a lot of noise. We want to make noise about, first of all, it's time to ratify. Why have we, the United States of America, not gone on record saying we support gender equity? And our delegate from Washington, DC, her name is Eleanor Holmes Norton, and she's a friend and neighbor, and we went to the same college. And so she is eager to wave this banner as soon as the time is right. And so we want to work for ratification, but she's also the leader on trying to get DC to become a state. And again, we don't have the right mix in Congress for them to vote to make us a state. So she will use this again as an example for why DC should become a state and should have 2 senators like other states and voting representation. We have more people in Washington, DC, more citizens in Washington, DC than 2 other states in the United States. And so we're not being treated fairly. So I will keep in touch with Sun Young Yoon and Jessica Pearson and others, and they can keep in touch with all of you about the status of all of this. But we are hopeful, but except for you, we're not talking about it too publicly because we don't want the Republicans in our Congress to say, no, you can't have this law. You're not a state. So I've covered a lot, but it maybe has raised a number of questions instead of giving you some answers. So let me know if there are any questions.
Yeah, coming from the Philippines, it's a bit complicated, but yeah, it's also very insightful with like how these sort of legislations are passed in the US, especially considering that in DC, it's not really, it's a bit more complicated because it's not really considered as a state, right? So yeah, those are my thoughts on it so far. And for the last question on my end is, we just like to ask you if what was the most like major milestone in the campaign so far?
Well, the major milestone is that we did get it reintroduced, and all but and so most of the DC council members have co-sponsored it. So and those that didn't co-sponsor, they just didn't get around to it. It was a busy time, but they're going to vote for it. All of the ones that I have spoken with, and so we've had the hearing. We need to have the votes, and then we wait patiently for the 30 days to pass. I mean, this points out one of the injustices in our democracy. I mean, I refer to Washington, D.C. as a colony because it's not a state and it has to ask permission to do things. But this may be one of the examples of that people will understand why we should become a state. And then I will work with Cities for CEDAW and try to help. We do communicate quite a lot through the United Nations Association chapter network about these issues. Hopefully we won't have to reintroduce it, that it will pass this time and become implemented. And then there are a lot of community organizations, nonprofit organizations that will be willing to work with the DC government to help with the implementation. But the first thing will still need to be, and it will probably be a collaboration between the mayor's office and Women in Policy Initiatives and the city administrator's office to collect that gender data. So the first step is to do a gender audit to identify where are there inequities and how can we correct them.
Yeah, and what Sun Yung said in the chat that yes, gender audits are absolutely the right place to start. So yes, thank you so much, Ms. Mulhauser. So for the next part of the interview, RJ will be asking you about the CEDAW bill, which is still on its way to be passed. So RJ, you have the mic.
So yeah, thank you for that very profound introduction. We've really learned a lot of information. And you've mentioned earlier that we're still waiting for the 30 days. We just want to know, how are you preparing for the outcome while we're waiting for the 30 days? Is your group planning any backup plans?
Good question. And it was nice of you to call my lengthy comment an introduction. It was covered a great deal. But it is a great question. And first of all, we're going to be very involved in trying to get it passed, as it will be passed once it's brought to the council floor for 2 votes. And then, you know, we're being advised to probably be quiet and let those 30 days pass, because if we get noisy, then that's just going to encourage, and there are an awful lot of people in Congress who have been passing legislation indicating they do not support gender equity. So we don't want to give them a platform to work against ratification and to work against our own local legislation. So when Sun Young asked if I would do this interview, I said, I explained why it might be complicated to make anything public for a while until the 30 days have passed. And she said, okay, we won't publish it until after the 30 days. And then we'll have an international celebration if we're able to do this, because it then will give us a platform and an opportunity to talk about ratification. And then we will be mobilizing through the UNA chapters around the country and all of the other women's groups and groups that support gender equity to make sure that it's being implemented if ratified. And so that may involve some research in other countries where the groups like ours have helped with implementation. But I think that we'll be able to figure it out. And there are the 50 states, and we will identify leaders in each of those states to monitor and make sure that gender equity is being implemented in their jurisdictions. So UNA USA has chapters in almost every state, and so they will be a big force. But I think that a number of other organizations will also want to be involved in the implementation. You may or may not know that 50 years ago, there was the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced a long time ago, but it was passed by Congress, and it has to, in order to be an amendment to the US Constitution, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, which has happened, but it has not yet been implemented. And the Equal Rights Amendment, in many ways, is parallel with what CEDAW is wanting to do. The Equal Rights Amendment would say that women have equal rights to men. And so these two parallel initiatives will become advocacy and lobbying focal points for not just for women's organizations, and there are a large number of them in this country, but for other organizations that believe in gender equity. And there's a increasing number of men taking leadership in saying that there needs to be gender equity, and that's incredibly helpful, because, you know, until men get out of the way and make room for women, we're not going to have true gender equity.
Yeah, thank you for that. I remember Nina Boulder giving us advice that we women should build our own chairs instead of waiting for the men to make room for us. So with that, we're getting more deeper into the CEDAW bill. We would like to know what were the important resources for you to get to the draft legislation. Were there any specific information that makes the bill distinct from other bills regarding women's rights?
I don't think so. It's very, very similar. I mean, it's good that there is this community, this network, the Cities for CEDAW in the United States, and so we're it's a good sisterhood trying where we support each other. But our community, because it's not it's a city and it's not a state, it's a colony. There are some differences with how it will be implemented. But I think it all makes sense. And the one problem with the legislation as it now exists is that the Office of Women's Policy and Initiatives will need to hire additional staff in order to carry out these additional tasks. And so that will have to be part of the budget process for next year, so that they could hire additional staff, because our budget process has ended for this year.
So yeah, before I pass the ball to the next interviewer, I would like to ask, to refrain from building any more barriers or miscommunication within the society, what were the use of language and proper terminologies that you guys used in drafting the bill? Are you using gender, sex, or self-identified as women to describe the people being affected by CEDAW? Did you use the reproductive rights in the legislation? Why or why not?
Yeah, reproductive rights is there, and I have been very involved, and as part of my introduction, it said that I was the director of NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, for eight or 9 years. And so that's a core issue. And as far as I'm concerned with reproductive rights, unless women and girls or people who get pregnant are able to decide when or if they're going to have children, they cannot avail themselves of all of the education and economic opportunities that are available to people who don't get pregnant. So it's just a basic human right for women to be equal with men. So we do refer to people, we do refer to women, and it's it's a good question, RJ. I'd like to look through it again to see if how to answer your question completely with regard to reference to people who identify as women or identify as men but have uteruses. So
Yeah, because we saw the importance of the use of language in drafting bills, especially there's a lot of barriers that hinders the people in the society nowadays. So yeah, thank you for that.
So thank you for all these very helpful insights on the DC bill, and we're all hoping for the best. And as Sunyong said earlier in the chat, we're here to make as much noise that we can to make this a reality. So from your involvement to CEDAW and the CEDAW legislature, we're now moving on to questions about your personal background and advocacy. So the first question is, what made you pursue the advocacies that you're involved with right now? Are there specific moments in your life that made you say, I want to devote my time learning about this issue, or I'm stepping up to devote myself in fighting this issue?
Okay, well, had you asked this question a year ago, I'd perhaps be more reluctant to be transparent, but ever since the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision was reversed, I have joined many other older women who have had pre-Roe abortions in telling our stories with the hope that people who are of reproductive age now, where abortion has been legal their entire lives in the United States, understand what it will be like if it is no longer legal and available. And so I started talking about my own personal abortion that I had way back in 1964. And you know, that's 9 years before Roe. So I was in college and I got pregnant. My diaphragm didn't work. And I had very supportive and caring parents. They probably would have helped me find an abortion, a doctor to do an abortion, but I was embarrassed. I didn't know what to do. I self-induced, which, you know, it's right there at the top of the list of the most stupid things I've done in my life. And I thought I had been totally successful. But 2 days later, when I was at the bus station to get a bus to go back to college, I fainted. And I woke up in the office of the bus terminal in a pool of blood. And the people around me must have known what had happened. But when I got up and said, "I'm okay, can I change my clothes?" they were eager for me to leave. So that obviously has influenced who I've become all of these decades later. So I'm in the counseling that I've done with hundreds of women and girls, and the training that I've done with doctors and nurses that provide abortion or work in family planning programs, I have never questioned anyone who says she wants an abortion, because if, you know, somebody as smart as me and, you know, with such a support circle would do something like that, I want to make sure that anyone who wants an abortion has access. So that's why, I don't know how familiar you are with the law in the United States now, but there are many, probably half of the states are going to be making abortion totally illegal. Many of them not even with exceptions for rape or incest. And so our midterm elections coming up on November 8th, the most important election of my long lifetime, because if we are able to increase the number of senators, they're all likely to be Democrats, that support abortion rights in the House and the Senate, then there can be a federal law that undoes that recent Supreme Court reversal of Roe, making abortion again legal in every state. But if we don't get the majorities in the House and the Senate and Congress, it's going to be up to state legislatures and governors to decide what the law is going to be in the state. And so I am spending all of my waking hours for the next 3 months, because the election is November 8th, trying to mobilize people who support abortion rights to get out and vote, and to vote at the very top of the ballot all the way down to the bottom. And I'm doing it in the introduction that you heard. I have done voter engagement work in the past, mostly with nonpartisan organizations, but there aren't any Republicans that agree with me on this issue. So this year I'm being very partisan, and that feels better because it did not used to be a partisan issue. When I was running NARO in the 70s, some of our strongest supporters were Republicans, but now all of the Republicans are voting against abortion. All of the Democrats are voting for it. So it's become a very partisan issue. So that's perhaps not the answer you thought you'd get, but that's the answer of why I've lived the life that I've lived, and why I've done sex education for high school students, and why I've done counseling for pregnant women and girls, and why I'm doing abortion outreach now and voter outreach.
It really does show how important it is to include reproductive rights in advancing women's rights, and to include stories like yours in making laws that protect women in general, like listen to the women who have these similar types of experiences. Coincidentally, that was our next question, since you had background in protesting in favor of women's reproductive rights. Since you've already mentioned how you got into how you've got into the different advocacies you're involved with right now, our last question is more for us, the generation next in line in continuing these advocacies. So, with so many years dedicated to forwarding human rights, specifically women's rights, what are some pieces of advice you could impart to us, the young women who look up to pioneers such as you, who want to embark on the same advocacies?
Well, thank you for that question. And I love intergenerational conversations, especially around gender issues. And so first of all, learn as much as you can about the issues you care about, so that when you do education and advocacy, you're knowledgeable and credible to the people who are listening to you, and vote. And the voter outreach program that I have used all of these election cycles, I call it Trusted Sources, because I work with the heads of organizations, the leadership of organizations, and help them get the voter messaging out to their members and donors and contacts. And with the nonpartisan organizations that cannot endorse candidates, many of them had never done any work at all in elections. But when they learned that they could do voter registration and get out the vote activities, they became very active. And so I think that just finding the ways and working with the people that you know to do effective outreach, whatever your issues that you care about, and gender issues is something that bring us all together today. But if there are other issues, learn as much as you can about it, so that you can be articulate, knowledgeable, and credible. And then in the Philippines, I'm not as familiar with the processes there, but communicate with the policymakers. My mantra at the bottom of my email signature now is, if you don't like the policies, we have to change the policymakers. And it's as simple as that.
Okay, that's.
And I said it early on, but I am so glad to be meeting with you. And one of the things that I did in 1989 is I started an organization in Washington, D.C. for young women. It was called Women Information Network. And a number of young women came to me and said, why are all you second generation feminists not helping us? Like the women who were at the head of organizations that they worked at were not showing them the ladder to grow and become leaders themselves. And I said, well, that doesn't sound like my friends. So I invited 8 or so young women and 8 or so former young women to come to a dinner, and we talked about this dynamic, and we changed it. The organization no longer exists, but for 20 years, we had mentoring programs and networking programs and education programs, all designed to help young professionals find the way to climb the ladder of success and become leaders. So counting on you to save the world, okay?
You got it. You have our trust. So that's all the questions that we have for today. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom, and that we'll all surely take to heart as we move the advocacies and initiatives forward. So before we end, is there anyone in the group who would like to ask Karen a question? I think we have a time for just one more question. Stuti.
Hi. So one super interesting thing, but really sad thing that I noticed while I was researching Toledo and comparing the differences between the proposed ordinance versus the one that actually passed, was that every clause that mentioned implementation, the word to implement or any conjugation of the word implement was stricken off. So it was an ordinance in name, but in practice, it seemed like there were no real effects. I wanted to know what the ordinance or the resolution that's being proposed in DC, if that's been an issue that's come up as well.
Oh, well, there really hasn't been a question. It is going to be implemented when passed and when Congress lets us have it. And it will be implemented through the Mayor's Office of Women and Policy Initiatives. And I've talked with them. They understand what implementation means. But again, first we need to have the gender audit so we know what implementation is going to be required. And it's also if some of the government agencies, the DC government agencies, need to have a better understanding, then the Office of Human Rights is poised to provide that training for how the agencies can improve the gender equity in their agencies. And again, I think there is going to be collaboration between the Mayor's Office for Women Policy and Initiatives and the city administrator to collect this data. That's the first step, and it may take a year to do that. But implementation is one of my favorite words, right after advocacy and voting.
Thank you for the answer.
Can I ask a quick question? I was wondering, Karen, if you can list some of the organizations who are in your coalition. I think it would be interesting to see if they like cross-cut with other cities that we've been researching.
Yeah, I will send Sun Young a list that we had in 2015, and we're still in the process of building the list for this year. But it's groups like League of Women Voters, Planned Parenthood, YWCA, and so forth. But I will send the list of the collaborating partners that we had last time, supporting organizations, and our work with them is to get them to get the messaging out to their members.
Karen, this has been wonderful. You are such a great source of wisdom for us, and we thank you very much for your time. And we want you back at some point.
well, I'll come back once we've succeeded. And it was wonderful to meet all of you, seriously, and counting on you to save the world. Work on that climate stuff too.
Exactly. So bye, everyone. See you on